Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining to us today. Really thrilled to have over 30 individuals in this conversation live with us. I do want to mention this session is being recorded and it will be shared by Code for America on a number of their social media channels after this session. So really glad to have so many individuals joining us now or in the future to have this rich conversation about housing loss at a community level and what types of data-driven, software-driven tools and innovations that we can really make to help combat that housing loss. I'm Caitlin Augustine. I'm the Senior Director of Product at Datakind, and I'm here to really moderate a panel for you today of local leadership across organizations, from our local state representatives to key leaders of housing organizations in Florida, to representatives from national think tanks and global foundations who are all helping drive solutions to the same problem. How can we help local leaders combat the impacts of housing insecurity using tools at our disposal, namely open data, open source materials? I just have a couple of quick slides to kick us off to orient us here. So I mentioned that I'm from Datakind. Datakind itself, we are a global nonprofit that harnesses the power of data science and AI in the service of humanity. And we do this through building partnerships with organizations at the community level and really taking a human-centered and community-centered approach to building out solutions that can be sustainable once us technologists leave the room. And we were really thrilled to partner with a number of the individuals on this call today to talk about and build out this solution that we are calling Displaced in the Sunbelt. So the solution wasn't displacing people in the Sunbelt, but the solution was that we actually did this deep dive at a local level, at a census tract level, into housing loss data. So collecting eviction and foreclosure data across counties in the Sunbelt to understand what housing loss looked like and to help build out a sense of what are the predictors of housing loss so that local leaders could use that information to help intervene and help keep more individuals in their homes. And this is a really thrilling and frankly very eye-opening experience for us at Datakind. And the reason that we were able to be successful is because, as you'll see on this panel, we had representation across all of the, what we say are the 6 components of a high impact data science for good solution. So we had individuals representing innovative funders who are willing to take a risk on building out solutions and investing in public interest technology. We had individuals with great subject matter expertise who actually knew the communities that we thought might be displaced and helped us get the data. We did bring in data scientists, and we certainly had those data sets, but we really had advocates and social actors who helped shape this problem statement to help us understand and drive these solutions that really make an impact in a community. So I'm just so thrilled to have nearly 100 individuals joining us for this conversation today. So without further ado, I'll actually introduce our panel here. So I mentioned I'm Caitlin Augustine. I'm the Senior Director of Product at Datakind. I'm probably the least interesting person in this conversation today. I'm really here to facilitate a conversation between our 5 great panelists. So what I'd love to do is to ask each of my panelists to give a quick intro, let's say 30 seconds or less, but who are you and what brought you to this panel? How are you thinking about housing insecurity and how to combat it? I'll kick it over to you, Representative Eskamani. Do you want to kick us off?
Thank you so much, Caitlin. It's an honor to be here today. And I'm representative for District 47 in the Florida State Legislatures. That includes the City of Orlando, Winter Park, Belle Isle, Edgewood. And I come to this work as someone who has experienced housing insecurity growing up in a working class immigrant family. And of course, as a state lawmaker during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw so many of the problems we already knew existed get far more worse. And these are systematic problems that requires really creative solutions, which is why using data tools empower us to make informed decisions and also help plan for the future.
So much, Rep. Eskamani, and so wonderful to have you here. I know you're just 2 days, I think, off the end of the legislative session, so we're really glad to be bringing you back into the policy conversation. Tim, I'd love to hand it over to you next.
Sure. Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Robustelli. I'm a policy analyst with New America. We're a Washington, D.C. based think tank. I work for the Future of Land and Housing program at the organization. We look at a host of issues, both internationally and domestically, when it comes to housing, land, and property rights, including housing instability across the United States. So it's exciting to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. And I would say I'm going to hand it over to Frank next, who really helped us build out this vision. When Tim came to Datakind and said, we have this idea for this solution, Frank was the one who helped connect us to all of the right people to really make this impactful. So Frank, over to you for an introduction.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Wells with Bright Community Trust. Bright works on housing access and housing affordability issues in several regions around Florida. As part of that, we were well placed to cross over with the great work that Datakind and New America did on housing loss in Orlando, Orange County, one of our key markets. We also serve as the convener of Central Florida's regional evictions and foreclosures task force in the face of the pandemic. And so this data is really crucial to us in looking at how we solve these issues, and particularly how we drive housing equity for those who are most challenged coming through this pandemic.
Thank you so much for being here today, Frank. Now, Shayna, Frank just mentioned how he's a huge convener of individuals and how it's really taken this whole group to drive the solution. So I wonder if you could introduce yourself and bring the perspective of the community to this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Shayna Lee, Director of Global Volunteers at Datakind. So as was alluded to, very much a champion of mobilizing communities, including our volunteer data science community, towards this issue. I have a personal and also a previous experience specifically in public health and health equity, recognizing that housing is one of those social determinants of health and the linkages for healthy outcomes within a community. So just thrilled and excited to be here.
Thank you so much for being here, Shayna. And then Nathan, would love to have you introduce yourself and give a little bit of the perspective that you're taking that is beyond just the community. It's many communities across the nation.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me, Caitlin. Really a pleasure to be here amongst this amazing panel. I have to say, you are definitely not the most boring person among the panel. I would consider maybe it would be me, considering I'm actually the newest to this space. My name is Nathan Poland. I actually work for the Rockefeller Foundation, which is the proud, sponsor of this work for Datakind and for New America and for this project that I think Tim will probably talk about more. I'm personally actually a data scientist, and that I think drives a lot of my interest in the work. And our foundation is actually a global foundation rather than one focused specifically on issues within the US. Of course, I think as people have alluded to, public health is, of course, deeply imbricated with communities and how they live and how they find housing and shelter. But our foundation is primarily focused on, the global scope. But our team specifically really found the work of New America and, of course, Datakind's technical excellence as a really interesting place to do some innovative funding and trying to get as much technical excellence into the subject matter areas as possible so we could drive impact on something that's a little bit closer to home, since we are a US-based foundation with a global scope. But really, it parallels a lot of our other work across the globe. So really excited to talk about that.
Well, I'm so thrilled to have the five of you here for a conversation today. And we have just about 50 minutes to talk, I would say just solve this problem of housing insecurity at a community level. So, start your watches. We'll have it fixed by the end. But seriously, the time is going to fly by, and I'd love to just ground us a little bit in just start in conversation. Set the stage. What does having this data enable? So I'm gonna start with you, Frank. You mentioned that you're leading the evictions and foreclosures task force. That didn't come out of thin air. Talk to us a little bit about why you felt this need to convene at a community level and to start to bring data together from so many different data sources.
Well, I think one of the findings that came out of your Displaced in the Sunbelt report really drives the work that we do, right? That when we look at housing loss in Orange County, about 1 in 50 households experiences a housing loss in a year, But when we look at majority Black neighborhoods, and particularly those that have been historically most marginalized within our community, that number can be 1 in 10, 1 in 7 in one particular census tract. And so we understand as we come through this pandemic with all the insecurity that brings, and particularly contextualized for Central Florida, right? This is the home of the world's biggest tourism economy. We experienced 250,000 plus lost jobs, primarily in that very low income hospitality, tourism, leisure sector. That leaves a lot of people very, very vulnerable here. And we've got to use that data to help us figure out where do we target these resources as they come out, right? Because what we've experienced kind of live on the ground, this is happening in cities and counties all around parts of Florida that we service, and in talking with colleagues around the country. It's very easy to put up a website and say, here's the help, come get the emergency rental assistance. But when we're not accounting for that technology divide, that digital divide that primarily affects communities of color, seniors, the disabled, people with limited English proficiency, we're leaving the people that most need the help out of the equation, and we're tilting the balance the wrong way on working toward housing equity. So having this data lets us better target the resources, and particularly the outreach, to get the folks on the ground to the right places to really help people one-on-one toward a more housing stable situation through this public health crisis.
That's such a powerful statement that, having this data at a local level actually helps us drive those interventions. Now, Rep. Escamani, I actually wonder if you almost have an addition there, knowing how much work you've done through the COVID-19 pandemic to help people who simply don't have data, don't have access to these tools to get the solutions they need. How has your experience over the past year, going on, I guess, close to 18 months, been in this conversation about housing at a community level, and how have you tried to drive solutions in that space?
Well, so much of this work is rapid response. We're constantly just managing one crisis after the other, after the other. So you don't really have a chance to get the bigger picture and breathe. But when you have data in front of you, you can almost predict where you're going to see the greatest housing need. You can predict what communities am I going to have to be very intentional in promoting rental relief programs. In particular, data shows us just the systematic racism that exists within housing inequities. And when all this national conversation, right, around systematic oppression and racial justice, with still folks who deny that these are actually legitimate problems, the data helps to tell a story where folks can't deny that. And it further amplifies the need to invest in communities of concentrated disadvantage, to try to revisit long-term housing policies that have created these disparities over time. Because a lot of the conversation around accessible housing is often framed on funding. And of course, funding is necessary and funding is needed. But let's be real, for some of our communities, there has been lots of funding that has been directed towards communities, and yet the problem still persists. So the data helps to tell a different story that kind of goes deeper into us understanding why are specific neighborhoods more at risk of eviction or foreclosure? What will be the effect of another pandemic in the future? How do we develop housing security policies and investments long term? And so having the longitudinal data not only gives you that baseline, but of course it allows you to measure success, because I can measure my caseload as a lawmaker. I can measure the types of calls we get, what percentage are housing related, what percentage are unemployment related. But at the end of the day, the best data is that long-term data over time that we can see the story being told and be able to either say we're on the right track or we still have a lot of work to do.
That's really an excellent opener to hand it over to you, Tim, to actually talk about this project. So Datakind and New America started work on trying to understand housing insecurity back in, I think it was October of 2019. So before the pandemic. And this work took on a new urgency during the pandemic. But Tim, I wonder if you could talk, what was the genesis of trying to understand and to build these tools? And what did you learn during this process?
Yeah, so we began this project, as you said, back in 2019. really trying to understand displacement throughout the United States. We had heard about problems surrounding FEMA aid and post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico, and thousands and thousands of houses being destroyed there. Other issues such as heirs property and Black land loss were in the news. Myself, like many others, read Evicted by Matt Desmond, and were sort of, turned on to the eviction crisis. And so what we originally wanted to do is try and capture most, if not all, displacement throughout the United States, all home loss that's occurring. And that was perhaps a bit naive due to some unavailability of data for many mechanisms of home loss. So we eventually settled on trying to track evictions and mortgage foreclosures in a number of counties throughout the United States. In our most recent research, it was in 7 counties in the US Sunbelts across the southern United States. Looking at larger cities such as Orlando and Phoenix to smaller towns such as Norfolk, Virginia, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And by mapping and analyzing evictions and foreclosures at the census tract level, we were really able to analyze and get a better, richer story of where housing loss was occurring. Displacement is so hyper-local. One neighborhood can be experiencing really acute home loss, and a neighborhood, just a few blocks down the street can be doing fine. So having that granular data really showed us the geography of loss and how it can just really affect different communities in myriad different ways.
I think one thing that the work that you're mentioning, Tim, also exposed to us was just, and because this work included not just data, where we have a number of data scientists on this call, and the machine learning and visualization approaches that we took, I think were really compelling, but also there were a number of qualitative interviews through the study, and that really exposed not just the patterns of housing loss, but the inability to find new housing. And I think that a theme that emerged was sheer lacks of affordable housing. So if an individual was lost their home, could they even find another? If an individual wanted to find a new home, perhaps they needed to escape a domestic situation, or they needed to move to be closer to work, did they have that opportunity? And the answer was sort of shockingly no. I think that one of the quotations from the study that New America authored with Datakind was that in the Orlando area, if you're making $15 an hour, it's unlikely you're going to find your own apartment. And so, Representative Escamani, I actually want to put it back to you. There was a lot of conversation that you led and you were very vocal about during this past legislative session about affordable housing. And I wonder how do you connect sort of these stories of the local data, the local experience, back to the policies that you're helping drive?
Well, it's definitely an area that needs more focus. And I say that because Florida, as an example, we have an affordable housing crisis. We've had that for years, if not decades. And in the last 10 years, we have rated what is our affordable housing trust fund called the Sadowski Trust Fund. And those dollars have been used to plug other budget holes, to the point where, according to some recent data, it's estimated that we are missing 344,000 units of affordable housing because of these depletions of this fund. This past legislative session, a permanent cut was made, but according to the majority party, it'll be the last cut made. But they did cut what is supposed to be about $400 million towards affordable housing to be $200 million, and the other pot of that money going towards water projects. So I say that we have a lot of work to do because I think that the story is not being told to policymakers, and that, first of all, there's a lot of assumptions made about who needs affordable housing. A lot of folks assume it's people who don't have jobs, or people who are homeless, or people who are not working hard enough, right? There's all this stigma about affordable housing. And then there's stigma of not in my backyard, where folks at a neighborhood level oppose the construction of workforce housing or affordable housing. And of course, we know that none of that is true, right? We know that having mixed income housing is better for neighborhoods, for everyone. We know that those who need accessible housing range in their age and in their work experience. We have seniors in Florida who can't afford to have a place to live on a fixed income. And we have for first-time homeowners or new families and folks who live in the service, who work in the service economy in our community, that are currently precariously housed, meaning they live in hotels and motels and they can't afford to have an actual rent or lease. So again, the data helps to persuade policymakers that this is serious, that if you've never experienced an eviction, put yourself in the shoes of someone who has, and to have empathy for that person and for an understanding for these systematic issues, and then do something about it. Especially right now with the CDC eviction moratorium being contested in different courts, there's a lot of stigma around those who need the moratorium. But again, I think the data can help explain, listen, these are legitimate problems. We're not just being dramatic or, making this up. Like, these are legitimate problems that we've known for years. The pandemic was a catalyst that made the problems worse, but the problems still exist and we should do something about it.
Well, if you don't mind me jumping in, I think we've also got to be able to articulate that an adequate supply of housing that fits into people's budgets is way less expensive than people getting evicted and being then unhoused and having to access services from that unstable situation, right? So this makes fiscal sense wherever you're coming at this from. It's also a limiting factor for the growth of businesses and the economy. If you want to look at this from that angle, one reason it's difficult to recruit and retain businesses in Florida is they take a look at the housing supply and they go, I can't move my workforce there. There's nowhere that I can afford to pay them that they can afford to live. So, I think we need to be able to articulate this issue from 360 degrees to make it make sense to everybody, because it's a crisis that we're all facing.
That's such a powerful statement too, and really just turning the statement on its head. It makes good sense, not just to be good people, but from business sense, from a functioning society sense. Like, as you said, Frank, it is better to have affordable housing than to try to work around this whole other process of eviction and having people move out of your community. I think that's a powerful and persuasive way, or certainly one more way to explain that we need to combat this crisis. And that's a bit of a segue that I want to push to you, Nathan. So Nathan, our first interaction in this housing loss space was actually in the eviction workshops that the New America team started to run. And I know I had conversations with you where each time I was pretty surprised at some of the outcomes, where we were hearing about, you can't access this data. You can't use the data if you access it. And people not even knowing how to use that information. So I wonder if you could kind of offer your perspective on what, how entering the space, what has been most impactful for you, and what's exciting you about the solutions that we're talking about here.
Yeah, happy to. I also just want to do a small callback to what I think Representative Escamani was talking about in terms of really the spectrum of this. Part of what surprised me too was really the spectrum of housing insecurity that plays out from what we know as people living in more transitory situations where they might not necessarily have a fixed address, to things that look like a full formal eviction, which of course go through the court system. And then there's the whole in between of what we call the informal evictions, where there isn't necessarily even a record of that, but we know people are being displaced on some level, even if we can't quantify it. And I think for me, coming to the space relatively new, coming more so from the data science and how do we, gear up software, machine learning solutions for society's problems, that was one of the really interesting things about this particular one, was that even the most formal, data solution is still only really, a proxy to some extent for the problem that we're really talking about. Evictions, again, only represent a small segment of what we overall call housing insecurity, which is, a complicating factor, but also really I think a motivating factor to understand evictions to the greatest extent possible, because they serve as a window into, again, some of the problems that people have outlined that exist at the community level when it comes to systemic racism, to housing segregation, et cetera. They really come through the formal lens of what's happening with the eviction policies or with eviction outcomes. From the data side, kind of diving in freshly, the most surprising thing was how much data was actually locked within court systems already, as in the data exists in some form. The issue is that oftentimes it's a deprecated form, or uh, it's locked away in PDFs as opposed to machine readable format, which means it's not easy to sort of get out of that court system, or one particular person holds the keys to those things in a court system and no one else really knows how to access it. I think for me, that was the most surprising thing, is that on the data system side, on the eviction data side, it's a little bit of a can of worms to realize to some extent how fragile our data infrastructure really is at, I guess the local and county levels. And eviction data kind of, for me, helped frame that out, is that there's actually a bigger problem here around civil justice data writ large, period. And that's, I think, something that really came out during the convenings that Rockefeller had the chance to fund at the end of last year with partners from New America, from the BIC Center, from the Eviction Lab, and a bunch of other folks that are doing amazing work, was really just how much of a big, big problem this is, which is really why it's exciting for the Rockefeller Foundation, because that's just an invitation to take the best subject matter experts and really apply technical excellence that I'm sure, Caitlin, you if you were on the panel, you would describe more about what Datakind does, but that's really what excited us.
That is so exciting. And before I move to a next question, because gosh, I have a million of them for you all. I'm seeing some pretty active conversation in the chat happening, and Frank in particular, I see you're responding to a number of comments. So I just wanted to give you a chance to verbalize anything that might be happening in the text here before I move past those topics.
Well, the sideline conversation that's roaring along is very interesting. This is one of the worst disparities I've ever heard of. In a lot of cases, we have some kind of an ordinance that says, something like inclusionary zoning, right? A developer building new units at market rate has to set aside some of them for affordable or workforce housing, but often there's some kind of a buyout provision. And in the vast majority of cases, developers take that. But in most jurisdictions, that number is way too low. It was already low when it started, and a lot of them are not indexed for inflation. So when they put one in place 20 years ago and haven't raised it in 20 years, the number is paltry. This, I got to guess, is California, $700,000 to build a new unit. The buyout is $5,000, like less than 1% of the cost of a new unit. That's atrocious. Big fan of community land trusts. That's how Bright Community Trust got started. So we're one of, or perhaps the largest land trust in Florida on both multifamily and single family stuff. Big believer in that kind of permanent preservation of affordability. The other thing I'd love to tag on to what Nathan said, though, is the gaps in data are pretty subtle, and we find them as we go down this road. So knowing about the number of eviction filings is great, but how many of those eviction filings get a judgment or have a CDC order interposed or get to a writ of possession, or right? We need to know a lot more than just how many evictions got filed, so that we know the right action to take on what portion of the crisis. And even as somebody mentioned earlier, the formal evictions are different from the abandoned leases and the cash for keys or the non-renewals that somebody gets helped out the door informally. So there's a lot more to the data when we start getting into really inform the work that we'd like to be doing.
Man, I feel like we could probably just pivot this to a conversation about land trusts and about the community solutions there. But I'm going to pull back to Nathan, what you said of, man, Caitlin, if you were on the panel, you could talk about Datakind. Well, luckily, one of my colleagues, Shayna, is on the panel here. And Shayna, I'd like to pull back to some of the comments that Representative Eskamani had said about, having empathy for your community and also beginning to build these relationships and to work as a community to solve a problem. Obviously, at Datakind, we talk about community. You are the leader of Datakind's community of volunteers. So this question's a two-parter for you. What does it mean to take this community approach to combating housing insecurity, and how does Datakind's community work toward the solving or helping solve problems like this?
Yeah, thank you. And such a great question. And I know my initial response is going to sound one may argue could be intuitive, but let's make the implicit explicit, which means, you definitely want to center the community in this work. So what does that mean? Making sure that community members that are being most impacted, disparately impacted by the problem, are being centered either through having them as actual stakeholders within this work throughout design, feedback, and even decision making when it comes to these challenges. I think are very important. They are the ones that are most impacted by the challenge, but also can be influenced in terms of any positive outcomes that come as a result of the work. So certainly making sure that we're centering the community in that work, understanding a community's context, their historical context, cultural context is also very critical in this work. Valuing the different types of expertise that are at the table, whether it's from a community member themselves or the different sectors that are involved, the housing area, policy, even health systems are taking notice of the impact of housing security issues or insecurity issues. So how can we leverage the different types of expertise that touch a community to come forward with solutions and resources? That means valuing the professional expertise, but also lived experience as well in that effort. Also, I would add that when working with communities, being prepared to do the work of relationship building and maintaining trust as well. A lot of times what we find is the communities that we want to engage in, there has been a history of mistrust or other things that have occurred in the past. So I think one must be prepared to be engaged in doing that work. It's not always easy, but it will be fruitful, especially as you're looking at sustainability and that partnership. Now pivoting a little bit to volunteerism specifically within Datakind. I think what's so exciting as well is that's actually how Datakind started in terms of identifying a need and putting an ask out there. Our founder said, I think there's an opportunity to mobilize a community of volunteer data scientists to address some needs. And he simply asked, and here we are 9 years later. So I say in terms of activating a volunteer community, again, it seems intuitive, but let's make that explicit. Share the needs and ask for the help. Oftentimes you have volunteers and community members in an interchangeable way as well that you can bring to the table. What's great is, again, going back to my earlier point of bringing different types of expertise to the table in that way. I will note that even better, if you're able to get a volunteer within the community that's being served, that builds opportunity for sustainability towards solving for those challenges as well. And then finally, I'll say in terms of volunteer activation, partnering with organizations that do this work. There's, again, no need to have to reinvent the wheel if there are community organizations out there that do this work that can quickly mobilize a volunteer community partnership. Those are the organizations that you want to identify for partnership.
I want to push this. I would just say, absolutely, like, let's drop the mic. Let's go just engage with our communities right now. But Rep. Eskamani, I want to give you a chance to respond here, because not only did you kind of open up this theme of empathy and really our community connection, but also your background is actually in community organizing. So as we talk about building tools for our community, what does that have you thinking about? What are those tools? Who gets those tools?
Well, great question. And thank you, Shanna, for outlining your lens on it too. And I love the chat. I'm seeing a lot of folks talk about empathy and equity. And I think one of the biggest priorities for us is to make sure outsiders making decisions for communities, which means when we collect the data, we need to share that data with the community. And I'm getting my PhD at the University of Central Florida, go Knights. And for anyone who's gone a PhD, y'all know it is hella hard. And one of the lessons we learn in data collection is the value of community participation research, right? And this purpose that our research is not just driven by adding to the greater body of knowledge, but the research is also driven by justice, right? It's driven by a social good. It's driven by wanting to give a community the information they need to make informed decisions and to not abandon them after that, but to actually find ways to connect them to long-term growth, long-term support. And one of my favorite books is Evicted. If no one's read, by Matthew Desmond, if folks haven't read it yet, you should. And it tells the story of a sociologist who embedded himself in different communities of concentrated disadvantage in Milwaukee, and both urban and rural. And I think that type of research is so compelling because he writes in his epilogue how he paid for someone's rent once, right? And just the very unique ethical questions that are right, candidly, but at the same time, when you are driven by empathy and driven by purpose, your intentions are much deeper than just learning about a community. The goal is that community learns with you, right, and grows from that. So I would challenge folks to think about the community into your research and into your results and into your work. When we did research in Paramore, which is a historic Black community in Orlando, we actually hosted a presentation for data with the community. And of course, you have to provide, food and childcare and think about some of the barriers that families have to participate in that environment. But it was worth it because it created the space where we didn't just interview you and never talk to you again, right? We wanted to give what we learned back and allow you to decide what you want to do with it. So that's probably my piece of advice, is to consider who are the community liaisons, the community leaders, who is someone that you interviewed and had that really desire to get more involved. I found in my advocacy and my direct constituent services the opportunity to connect directly impacted people to an organizing group that they can continue to build power with. Might not be my office, maybe it can be another partner out there. So to think about as you're doing this work.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a really great opportunity. Well, I would say I'm going to make this opportunity to segue to talking about tool development. And I want to put this to Tim, to you first, but then Nathan, as someone who's deeply engaged in this, Datakind and New America, we did this work. We've put it in the chat a couple of times, where 8 counties out of the 3,000 in the United States, we were able to build these maps and do these deep dives. It's not sustainable to have one organization be the gatekeeper to that insight, right? We could, you could give us your data, sure, and we could keep building those maps. But instead, we said, we need to build tools that would allow anyone to unlock their data in this way. And there's been a lot of intentionality in talking about how this tool is created, how it's accessed, who gets to steward it. And so, Tim, I wonder if you could give a little bit more of the thinking around why did this whole project pivot from let's get 100 counties signed up to make some maps for them to let's build the tools so that everyone could derive these insights themselves. So, Tim, first to you, and then Nathan, please, to add some additional color.
Yeah, absolutely, Caitlin. As you said, in some of our previous research, we went to the courts in various counties and pulled data for, a certain subset of years, say 2017, 2019. And that provides sort of a one-time snapshot of what's happening on the ground when it comes to evictions and foreclosures. And while, we do think, and we have seen, that communities that are impacted by housing loss in the past continue to be impacted by housing loss. It's probably worse now amid the pandemic and the economic downturn. But, those snapshots don't allow stakeholders, people with on-the-ground knowledge, to be dynamic and to be responsive, as Representative Eskamani said earlier in the presentation, to some of these challenges. By, sort of flipping what we're doing and providing the tools and the platforms where county courts or housing advocates or local decision makers can sort of input that data themselves and generate their own insights based on their really specialized hyper-local knowledge of what's happening, to do that continuously, hopefully, and have a better understanding of what current trends are, what happened a month ago as opposed to what happened 3 years ago. We think that can be a really powerful tool for making data-driven decisions when it comes to the allocation of outreach, making sure that at-risk tenants even know about rental assistance programs, and then further directing resources and aid to where it needs to go. So by providing sort of the script or the code where hopefully a county or city's IT department can take the data from the courts, generate some maps, and hand it off to the local decision makers, and to go from there, is something that we think will be really powerful. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I'm happy to follow on that. First of all, with the chat's absolutely amazing with all the recommendations. So I'm going to +1 Color of Law and also put in there Race for Profit by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, a phenomenal book as well. But to build on what Tim was describing, I think it's really helpful to sort of think of a specific use case that has kind of arisen. And Tim, you could probably talk about it more, but actually last year at sort of the earlier crest in the pandemic, I believe there was a jurisdiction in Indianapolis specifically, that actually used, I guess, maps generated at the census tract level by New America to allocate, I think it was $15 million worth of CARES funding with a little bit more sort of precision and accuracy to actually target the neighborhoods and the census tracts really that were experiencing that sort of high likelihood or high risk of eviction or displacement or insecurity. And I think sort of having those use cases in mind is helpful for thinking about exactly what these tools are attempting to accomplish, which is great. And another really big value for me personally, but I think also for the foundation, is what Tim described in open sourcing these tools and making sure that anybody can access them. So of course, the point is to develop these tools and turn them over to the people that have the data to actually produce those data, but that ultimately it's a public output that's being generated by these things. It's a repository that obviously people at the local level can use, but also communities would be able to access and engage with. And I think that kind of runs through the whole sort of data system that we're really, I think, trying to instantiate, which is both that the insights are open source, the code is open source, but then also the insights are open source, and that there's a way to engage the actual community with the data that we're generating. Because to Rep. Eskamani's point, it is really about the communities and how we can basically give a empirical argument to what I find is often a lived experience that they probably already have or have knowledge of because it's their community. And the numerical, the quantitative data is really just an empirical currency for that sort of thing, which is obviously what our power systems, what our political systems run on. And so I think part of that is also trying to empower the communities to be able to say, we know what's happening in our communities. There's this data that actually brings that out, and being able to push for power and push for change at the local level as well.
A really powerful statement, and it actually goes to there's a question that came in through our Q&A about how do data science volunteers actually get to be brought in and engaged with the community voices on a project. So Shayna, this is for you, and I'll tee off with saying data science is often one part of an overall solution, and a data scientist who goes into a conversation with a community, yes, should do data science, but also should know when to step back. And I think some of the most powerful pieces of feedback I've experienced at Datakind as a volunteer at Datakind and then as a staff member myself is to say, when the data science is not the first, second, or third solution that you need. And so example of that has been in times where we've tried to build apps and had an assumption that there'd be enough broadband coverage that people could use a phone-based application to generate insights or generate information. But Shayna, wonder if you want to add anything about training that we provide volunteers, and again, this theme of centering empathy and in the space.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Thanks, Caitlin, for bringing that up. And yes, that is part of training that we do offer to our volunteers as they come up to speed with learning the context about the challenges, the community that's being impacted, and approaching it with curiosity, I think, is a big piece. And so we do offer various training tools and resources to help ensure that we're fostering that curiosity and of our volunteers to ask questions, being able to show up as experts, but also listeners. And that is a delicate balance to have in terms of being able to, certainly have confidence in the expertise that you bring to the table, but then also recognizing there's other types of expertise and voices that can be brought in to provide context, especially to the work at hand. So yes, that is something that we provide through various trainings and resources on an ongoing basis. This isn't, a one-time training and then that's all the volunteer has to go through. This comes through a variety of ongoing conversations that really get at understanding that delicate nuance.
I think that that's so important to emphasize. And one thing that I'll also mention is that we are acutely aware of the data ethics. So, for example, eviction and foreclosure data, if you can extract it from your court system, and I actually live in Representative Escamani's district. I live walking distance from our courthouse, and I was able to get the data that we used in mapping. And it's public data, but it's probably public data of the worst day of someone's life. And you have their name, you have their address, you have the amount of money that they were evicted over, which sometimes can be tragically trivial amounts of information. And I think one thing that we do at Datakind is we have a lot of training about the sensitivity of the data that we have and why we are extracting it and why we are using it and how we are treating that. That go beyond, say, your standards just for open data. And that actually takes me to a question I wanted to put to you, Frank, and I'm going to cheat a bit because I think I asked you a version of this question on a different panel yesterday, but talk to me a little bit about who is being missed in this data, because I think you have tremendous insight in this thing that the data shows people who perhaps had homes in the first place, who have access to the court system, who are being evicted formally. Talk to us about what is being missed in our current data collection and what you hope to see in it.
Sure. So when we're looking at headline kind of county level numbers, what we're seeing is how many evictions were filed, for instance, and break that out by census tract based on the address in the file. We know that much. That doesn't tell us a whole lot about the story, particularly through the eviction here, about the story of that eviction, what's actually happening. And as part of our regional evictions task force, we have the nonprofit sector, the continuum of care, the United Way, the city and county staff folks, the legal aid, but also the apartment association and the realtors, right? We want everybody around the table here. And we've learned a lot from having the bigger landlords at the table, because they're able to inform what they know, which is way more than appears in the public record filings. They can tell us how many tenants have a payment plan, and we got to that instead of an eviction filing, or how many people are behind in rent and how far, how many leases have people walked away from. Those kinds of things we don't have access to at a public kind of level, but those are all the steps. By the time something becomes an eviction filing, now, like you said, it's in the public record, and we may have strong ethics about the use of that, but there are commercial companies out there that are harvesting that data and selling it to the next landlord to say, this person's had an eviction filed on them or been evicted. You don't want them as a tenant, probably, right? So everything that we can learn that leads up to that point also gives us a chance to intervene before things get into the public record, when it becomes a lot more problematic. And as I'm sure Rep. Escamani could tell us, it's very, very difficult to get something crafted at a legislative level to fix it after the fact, right? We would way rather have opportunities to intervene and get to people before they get to that eviction filing, before they get to that foreclosure filing. It's a cheaper, faster intervention, and it's going to be less damaging over the long term for sure.
Rep. Escamani, since you were name dropped there, do you want to respond to anything that Frank said, or add to it before I completely take us in another direction?
Totally. I love how Frank drinks his glass of water after making a good point. He's like, and that's the tea. No, but I think it's very well said. Like, it's really hard especially in states like Florida, where majority at a state level, when you're in the minority and you're centering your platform on these issues, it's hard to get traction, right? Like, to be candid. However, I do think this is where local governments play such an important role at a city and county level. I think we often overlook the role the municipalities can play in not only seeking this data, but using this data and building relationships with folks at a neighborhood level. Because at the end of the day, y'all, these problems, yes, they are macro, but there are so many micro solutions at a city local level, so many opportunities to pilot programs and to really try to build relationships with tenants. I mean, I've had conversations before the pandemic with Orange County, specifically where I am, about piloting a pro bono service, like piloting free access to attorneys in the face of eviction. Florida does not fund civil legal aid in our state budget. Sometimes we get member projects, but there is no line item for civil legal aid in Florida. And so, counties and cities can step up in that way. And we know based on data that if you have access to an attorney, then there's a really good chance the eviction will not proceed, right? And so, I think that having these proactive conversations with your elected officials at a local level and any level, but especially local level, proactively with ideas in mind, and to not only talk to the lawmaker or the elected official, but also the staff at government levels. We often overlook the role of public administrators in solving these problems, and so public administrators are overworked and overwhelmed. So to come into this space with data readily available, or with the desire to search for data, could also be very helpful in building a relationship with a public administrator, to get them also to have that buy-in and to be your facilitator to the elected official.
Absolutely, and connecting what the data tells us to what can be implemented on the policy level. That Indianapolis example is fantastic. When anybody on this call looks at your data and you see where are the zip codes, where are the census tracts that are most vulnerable, get your elected officials on the phone, whether it's a city, a county, a state rep, and say, what are we doing about getting resources there? Not here, right there. Because that's the kind of very direct local political advocacy that makes all the difference.
I feel like the two of you are already starting to steal what I shockingly, I'm heading into our closing comments, where we're looking at just about 5 minutes or so left on the clock here. And what I'd love to have each of you comment on is just, what is giving you hope, and like what is driving, what are you thinking about next? We're we're either vaccinated or close to it on this call. The world's opening up, but as everyone has mentioned, these were issues that happened before the pandemic. They're issues that persist. So what is giving you hope in our ability to combat these housing insecurity issues at a community level? I'm going to start with you, Tim, and then ask you to popcorn it to someone else.
I'll say that there's increased attention and increased momentum at the federal level around these issues. There's more understanding that we need better eviction data, both at a national level and at a local level, to better understand and better address evictions. There's a need for capacity building at the local level when it comes to setting up data infrastructure, having the proper staff to collect, steward, and share this data. And hopefully that can come from Washington, D.C. based on this better understanding. So I'd say there's momentum to make this work happen at the federal level, and there's a real desire to make it happen at the local level. So if we can get some synergy between those two, maybe we can move the needle. I'll pass it over to Nathan.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Excited for all those things that you mentioned, Caitlin. Those sound great. Excited for Rep. Eskamani finishing her PhD. That sounds phenomenal. And in terms of eviction data specifically, I'm really hopeful about sort of the conversations we were able to have in the convenings as part of New America and Datakind's work, and then the ongoing conversations that I know New America and I've had the chance to sort of ride along on with these local entities or people at the I guess, county level or at the city level, how many folks are really interested in trying to do something about eviction data in their local communities? That has been, for me, probably the thing that gives me the most hope, is that obviously federal level change is very important and it's going to be a key piece of the puzzle, but also just having so many people looking to make a difference in their local communities. And I would name drop them, but I'm not sure if that's appropriate just yet. But knowing that there's just so many people within government at the local levels, the municipal side, I guess I should say, that want to make some of these solutions happen at the local jurisdiction, and those can be models for more and more jurisdictions looking to do the same. That's probably what has me the most hopeful.
Again, and I'm going to push it to Shana next, and also just comment that, Shana, you haven't weighed in yet on this Florida schools debate. I'll mention I'm a Miami grad. We have Rep. Escamani at UCF, but Shana is actually a Tallahassee individual.
Yes.
So quite a lot of Florida representation. But Shana, what is giving you hope here? So.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, Florida State University represent that. But really what gets me excited is just the grassroots efforts of bringing these issues to the table and having courage in these discussions across different sectors and communities. That's what really gets me excited and mobilized, whether it's the community members themselves, volunteer community, all coming together. Again, this is not easy work, but collectively and with courage and empathy that we've heard, that's what inspires and gets me excited about this work.
Bringing it back to community. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Frank. Can you tell us, what's making you hopeful? And then Rep. Escamani, if you could bring us home here.
So I'm really excited to see the conversation about capacity building. I love the plus 100 capacity building. Right on. We've got the dollars. This is the thing that's exciting me the most about this new administration and the interventions taking place now is we have a historic amount of funding coming down and dollars for capacity building built in, right? The Trump administration's guidance was 10% of emergency rental assistance dollars had to cover everything from outreach to case management to internal staffing for the city and counties that administered it. The new guidance from Treasury is 10% for outreach, case management, those kinds of housing support services, and an additional 15% for admin costs. We went from 10% to 25% of the dollars dedicated to capacity building, essentially. And the amount of dollars coming down in the American Rescue Plan Act that touches not just housing, but homelessness, but food assistance, but childcare, all these other things is really historic, and it's an opportunity to rebuild the system in a way that's more just so that we come out of this stronger than we went into it. Take us home, Rep.
I mean, yes, like capacity building, I think is all of our desires and also our needs. And I always encourage nonprofits, especially, that we can't keep acting like we're in a place of scarcity when we know there are resources out there, but they're just being spent in the wrong ways, especially in a state like Florida. We passed the largest budget, $101 billion, thanks to the American Rescue Plan that gave us $10 billion. But of course, we still have this cut to housing dollars. So it further emphasizes the importance of building a coalition around these issues, using data as our guide, and being unapologetic on housing access, like being direct on the intersectionality of how this also plays a role in public transportation or mental health or minimum wage jobs, right? Like all that's connected. So the one thing that gives me hope is I think more and more advocates are not just existing in silos. We are existing these other platforms, and we're not being shy to say that those minimum wage jobs, even when these corporations sometimes make donations to housing projects, like your minimum wage jobs are the systematic problem that I keep trying to address with affordable housing. But if you increase your wages, this systematic problem wouldn't be here as much, right? So like being brave enough to challenge the status quo in different ways, and even challenge folks who say they're our partners, but they're partners in a more shallow way than actually like a systematic way. I think that's what gives me hope, because we're seeing more of it, and we have to continue that conversation and get action out of it too. See a shift in how things are done, because it's very clear that it's not working.
Oh man, what a way to end it. So I'll just say what gives me hope is all of you and all the different parts of the community that you represent, and really the 140 plus people who joined us for this conversation today, who are on the front lines of developing their communities and improving access to services and access to opportunity for all in the community. So that's what gives me hope. Conversations like this and the work that we're going to take back to the spaces that we hope to improve. So just a huge thank you to our panelists here. I learned a tremendous amount. I really appreciate the conversation you had going. And to everyone in the audience, please keep this going on Twitter. Please keep it going on LinkedIn. Please shoot us an email. We're really grateful that you were here and spent the time with us today. So thank you.
This was fantastic. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, all.